Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Colton, and in this video, I'm gonna do the first of a series of videos comparing the Pentax 645D to the Pentax 645Z. And in this video, the comparison is gonna be on the physical camera bodies themselves. So any similarities and any key differences between these two cameras as far as their physical bodies are concerned. A later video, we'll look at image quality, sensors, all that good stuff. But I want to start us out by thanking What Other Hobbies for lending me his 645Z. This is not a cheap camera, so I appreciate that he put his trust in me to handle his camera for the purpose of this comparison. So I really appreciate that. I'll put his info in the description of this video if you want to check him out. But again, huge shout out, huge thanks to What Other Hobbies for lending me his camera and making this comparison possible. Now, to get us started, a few tidbits about these two cameras. These are both digital medium format cameras produced by Pentax. The 645D is going to use a 40 megapixel CCD sensor, and the 645Z is going to use a 50 megapixel CMOS sensor. So a little bit different technology there, but they use the exact same mount, and that mount is also reused from Pentax's medium format film cameras. So a camera like the Pentax 645N, which is a film camera, the lens that work on that camera will also, for the most part, work on these digital cameras. I think there may be a few of the lenses that do require an adapter. All of the film lens that I've ever tested, which are mostly FA lens, so autofocus film lens, have worked without an adapter flawlessly on these digital cameras. So that's definitely something that they share in common. Now let's jump into a general discussion about the similarities of these two cameras. So again, super similar design. You would be forgiven if you thought these were the same camera on first glance, because they do look nearly identical to one another. I think it's pretty similar to other camera series. So if you're looking at a Canon 5D Mark II versus a Mark III, they're probably going to look pretty similar. A Sony a7 II and a7 III, more or less the same case. But these two cameras definitely look very similar to one another with some minor differences. But things that are pretty comparable between the two, I would say weight, the feeling of the ergonomics, the general button sort of design or layout, viewfinder, mirror system, all of that stuff is pretty much identical between the two. So you won't see a lot of differences there. There's really just a few key differences. And that's what I want to talk about next, is the big key differences between these two cameras. So the biggest difference is going to be the LCD screen. On the D, it is an integrated screen, so it is built right into the body. It doesn't move. But on the Z, it's a double hinge tilting mechanism. So that LCD can pop out, but it can also tilt up or down. And that's a nice feature. It's especially useful for the Pentax 645Z because the 645Z introduced video capabilities and the ability to do live view. Those are features not present on the D. So in the case of the 645D, you're really only using the LCD to adjust exposure settings, look through the menu, or view photos that you've taken. None of that really requires that the screen tilt or move around. Whereas on the 645Z, you have all of those functionalities and reasons to use the LCD, but you also might be shooting video, or you might be enabling live view, which are heavily dependent on the LCD screen and thus make a more captivating case for having a screen that can pop out, tilt up, tilt down. So definitely super useful on the 645Z. Now, that leads me into the second point, which is button layout. And as I mentioned before in the similarities section, the button layout does make the cameras look very similar, but there are some differences on the Z. specifically because that LCD now tilts out. We're removing the buttons that were along the bottom of the 645D, and we need to find new homes for those buttons. And then in addition to that, we're adding in functionality. We now need a record button or a live view enable button. And so we're having to rework some of those buttons on the Z for that purpose as well. So mainly that affects the back area of the 645Z, where you now have a record button and you have some buttons which have been moved around and reallocated into other areas. That said, utilizing these cameras feels very similar. Obviously, I feel more at home on the 645D because that's my camera, but using the 645Z, just a few minutes of playing around and I had pretty much figured out what those buttons did and where everything had moved to. So not a major difference by any means. Now with the buttons changing, we also moved the remote button from the back to the grip or side of the grip, which initially I was like, ooh, I don't know if that's a good spot for it. I don't want my hand getting in the way. But the more I thought about it, I kind of realized, well, ultimately, you're not going to be holding the camera if you're using a remote in most cases. So I really couldn't think of a situation in which that would be bad placement. So it's just different placement, but not necessarily bad. Both of these cameras use maybe a little bit more outdated port technology, but the D is definitely going to be much more outdated. So on the D for HDMI, you have an HDMI mini port, not super common. So you're probably less likely to have an HDMI mini cable laying around. Whereas on the Z, it's an HDMI micro, and that is a much more common or widespread type of port for these kind of cameras. So that maybe you're more likely to have already available. And then same thing with USB. I think actually in USB, you're probably not going to have either one of these ports. They're both old and outdated. And so you may have to either look around and see if you have any old technology that utilized one of these USB ports, or you're just going to have to go out and buy a new USB cable. That said, the transfer speeds are going to be better on the Z, and the type of cable allows for faster transfer speeds. Whereas on the D, it's going to be like USB 2.0 speeds and a USB-B cable. So a little bit older, kind of like PlayStation 2 era or PlayStation 3 era type of USB port. And the last big difference here is going to be the processor. That kind of gets outside of the physical body in my opinion, but it is worth calling out. The Z has a much improved processor, and because of that, it saves pictures a lot faster. That's always the big gripe on the 645D, is that it takes so long to save pictures to the SD card. And a lot of that is just due to the processor speed. So a lot of that is resolved on the 645Z and definitely something worth calling out. Now, in my use of these two cameras, again, I didn't really see much difference on the physical body between the two outside of faster processing times and the live view capabilities of the 645Z. But otherwise, the buttons are relatively the same. The weight's the same, the ergonomics are the same, and so they're pretty much more or less the same camera with changes more so under the hood. But in conclusion, I think if you're looking at these two cameras and you're wondering which one to go with or which one's better, I'd say on the physical side, I'd probably hand it to the 645Z for the fact that that LCD pops out and it has live view, which really could be a game changer for some folks. Definitely makes the camera a bit more functional in a more modern world. But if you don't really care about live view or shooting movies, then the tilting screen isn't a big deal. And at that point, really either camera could satisfy you in terms of the physical body. Now, we will in a later video explore image quality, sensors, color science, all that good stuff, and that is probably likely to be the bigger factor in choosing one of these cameras over the other. But as we wrap up this video, I do want to thank What Other Hobbies once again for lending me his 645Z for the purpose of this comparison. Huge thank you. And again, his info is in the description. If you have any comments or questions about these cameras, let me know down below. I'll be more than happy to do my best at answering any questions that you have or giving you any info that you might find helpful in picking one of these two cameras. And if you enjoyed the video, do give me a thumbs up. If you want to see more content like this, or if you want to join me on my photographic journey, hit the subscribe button, ring the bell, and that'll keep you in the know for when the next video drops. But for now, I'm Colton. I'll see you in the next one.